Hi, welcome everybody. I am so excited to be with you again for our future of work conversations. I'm Tirza Hollenhorst. I'm the CEO of Lumen, and today I'm really excited to have our first guest on. This is Kirsten, and she's the managing partner at Employera. She was previously head of employer brand for Glassdoor, and she is a go-to industry pro for building, improving, and managing your employer brand. Today's topic is building effective workplaces for the future, tips and strategies with Kirsten for employer branding. During this session, we're going to cover some key questions related to employer branding that will be of interest to leaders and anyone dealing with back to office questions. We encourage you to participate and ask any questions you have, but without further ado, let's begin. Kirsten, can you tell us a bit about how employer branding's been affected by remote work?
Employer branding. Yes, I would say one of the things that becomes really important in this is in the shift from really the recruiting side is the employee experience side of things. So while it's true your employer brand has always really been defined by the people inside your company, um, more and more as companies are starting to maybe divest a little bit in recruiting or even layoffs, the how becomes more important than ever. And how do you tap into the employee voice? How do you promote that? And really thinking about, I think, the entire journey all the way through, and building advocates with your employees that build goodwill. It's a lot right now about, and the opportunity really is around building loyalty. I think
Mhm.
companies are really focused on what they need, bottom line, as they should be, as they always have been. But as we return to hybrid, um, you think about the transition that we had to make during the pandemic, and companies provided a lot of support for employees.
Mhm.
In many cases, it was companies that maybe hadn't really done that great of a job. And suddenly, right, they started to really think about the individual. Managers were thinking about the individual. Um, and now it's like, all right, party's over, everybody, let's go back. As if
Mhm.
it was this really fun time that was really easy, right? And now people are transitioning back, and companies are not putting the same kind of thought against it, right? So what happens when there's daycare shortages out there and you have to come back by a certain date, but now you have to spend money you hadn't planned for, maybe you've moved, right? And so there's a really big emphasis, or there needs to be a lot of thought as part of the how do we transition back? It's not just from a company perspective, like what days do they come back? How far away, does someone live before they come back? We're thinking about all these policies. But if you really want it to be successful, you have to think about how do we need to empower people to be
Mhm.
successful in either environment,
Mhm.
right? And that's the tricky part that we haven't had to do before. And so there's a lot to think through. But if we prioritize the employee experience, what that really means for you is you build loyalty, right? That builds a lot of trust and goodwill. Um,
Mhm.
when things change and people have opportunity to go somewhere else, if they decide to do that, they'll stay with you, right? So a little investment now plays off a lot in the end. So, where employer brand has always been about kind of attraction, it's really moving in and sitting in a place of retention, and that employee experience piece.
Mhm. Um, I love what you're talking about here. That we really there was so much about the personal, and when we had this big shift to work from home, I feel like we were in this incredible moment of care and authenticity and concern and appreciation that everybody was struggling. There was a sense of kind of in it together, and now as we're shifting, there's a little bit more of a like, well, this just needs to happen, and almost just a direct approach that's really perhaps leaving out the individual. And
Mhm.
I'm hearing a lot of conversation that's coming from the perspective of just should we come back to the office, how and when. And I'm curious from your place, are these even the right questions we should be starting with?
Well, no. um, And I'll tell you why. It's not that, as a business has to think about its bottom line, right? And so, especially right now, as we're looking at a lot of, financial kind of scary stuff, reading reports, we're seeing a lot of companies do layoffs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, how do we return? Should we return? Yes, makes sense. But I think there's something more fundamental that we could ask, which is, what is the opportunity we have right now?
Mhm.
Right? That it's not a new normal. It's not the party's over, we just need to get back to work kind of thing. There's an opportunity to think a little bit differently. I was actually just talking with a neighbor yesterday who has worked in tech, has gone through a layoff, has gone through a certain job, different, a lot of interviews. He's a new dad, and as he was looking for a new job during this time, it was really important to him to find a company where he could work fully remote so that he could be home, right? People are they've had the ability to prioritize different things. And he used the word unlocked, which I loved. And he was talking about how when he was at the office full time, he was really great at having lunch with people, going out for drinks afterwards. And during the pandemic, he said what it unlocked for him was this kind of other side of what he loves.
Mhm.
And it's different for everybody, right? So I'm a working mom, and I have been for a long time. Um, and I said to him, "Oh, well, I think you're finally seeing what a lot of people have seen, which is if you have a company that allows you to live your life more kind of richly, more effectively, you like walk through fire for them."
Mhm.
Right. And so I think there's an opportunity here for companies to really think about how do we support kind of allowing people to continue to live into kind of this richness of
Mhm.
both things. And it doesn't have to be a one or the other. It doesn't have to be both. I don't think it's about where we are. I think a more significant thing is what is the opportunity we have right now and how do we harness that? Right?
Mhm.
How do we harness people's excitement to work? People want to work. It's not a chore. It shouldn't be a chore, right? You want to be home. So we can enable both. How can we enable both? And I don't think the question is about where. And even if it is part of the question, right? If part of the answer, I think it's not a question. Hybrid is maybe an answer. The how still is okay, we have to support people from a technology perspective. They have to be able to interact, have to be able to do their job effectively. If they go to the office, what does that mean? And the first question, though, really truly is how do we harness the excitement people have and really thinking differently about what opportunity we have? I just, there's kind of this we need to go back. How do we make it as kind of consistent as it used to be? But we have to, I think the real opportunity is leaning into what's new, what have we not thought of before, what kind of things are unlocked for us as a business, for us as people that we could really lean into and do this kind of differently because we can.
Yeah, I'm always struck by this, kind of back to office as though there was any way we would go back to 2019. So many things have changed technically, socially, in our expectations and what we think is possible. That there's really no like sense of going back. And I really appreciate orienting toward this. What do we need now? What are we ready for now? How do we support people from where we are? And we've really been thinking about this coming back as not coming back to the office, but what value is there in co-locating? What work really benefits from us being closer, and coming back to that idea that if we're doing things that build team, regardless of whether we're using online tools or we're leveraging the power of in-person work, it's that sense of team and camaraderie and coming together that adds to loyalty. It builds psychological safety and a willingness to
Mhm.
challenge. It builds learning communities. It builds mentorship and sponsorship, and that like those relational things are very important. But that building those is about focusing on relationships, team, loyalty, psychological safety first, and looking at what benefits that rather than focusing on location and then looking at the human aspect after.
Mhm. It's tricky,
Um,
right?
it's tricky. It is tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, for like employers looking to really build their brand during this transition, like what advice do you have about how to really leverage this opportunity?
The first thing is not to kind of, I think, have this attitude um, of like, well, they should just be lucky they have a job.
Mhm,
Um, because there are a lot of options still. Right back
mhm,
in 2010, I had worked for a big tech company, and it was kind of this downturn, right? And
mhm,
my first role was about how do we drive engagement, right? And there very much, I think, among some folks was an attitude of like, look, these people should just be lucky they have a job. Like, and from a business perspective, they had to pull back on certain benefits. They had to pull back on things. There was like a right sizing of stuff.
mhm,
I think the misstep that was happening then among a lot of companies, and it's happening again, I see it, is what do we need to do as a business to cut back? And I think the opportunity is what do we need to do as a business to create loyalty?
mhm,
Um, it doesn't mean you can't cut back. It doesn't mean there can't be right sizing, but it's being really thoughtful about the moves that you make and how you make them
mhm,
is critical. You see a lot of stuff right now about the importance of communications and communications from leaders. And we're seeing things shift in our business. No, shift, but we're getting a lot more calls and concerns from companies who are realizing, like, ah, what's always worked is not working now.
mhm,
And we made some missteps, and now we've got to figure it out, right? Companies have been making this move to hybrid, back to work full time, whatever it is, right? Without really thinking about what is going to be and having maybe done a full analysis, like a cost benefit analysis, how many people might have to leave because of that. And there was kind of this sense of like, this is what we have to do as a business. People are going to have to get on board. They will get on board eventually. We'll kind of ride this out. And what they're seeing now is people are leaving projects and they can't now staff what they need to staff. They can't deliver on projects and promises and solutions they said they were going to. Now we have a problem. And now there's like maybe we could have done this a little bit differently.
mhm,
How you time it, how you pace it, the language you use, how you bring people along in this journey is job number one.
mhm.
Absolutely job number one. Maybe I'm getting off a little bit topic for what you asked. What
Um,
can you be doing this transition? Yeah, so I think one of the really key questions here is how do we build loyalty? Um, as people do have options, if you're asking them to go back, they have to have a reason to.
mhm,
It's not just like my work has to make sense, but I care about the work I do. And given I have a lot of opportunities, I'm still going to stick with this one, even though it's going to be transition for my company and for my family that I'm going to have to ride out. There's value in doing that. And I have a reason for why I care here. And it has to be now that I also feel cared about, right? That the company's thinking about the burden that's being put on me as well, and helping people make that transition effectively, right? If I want to make the transition, but I now literally can't, then what?
mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate what you're speaking about around this kind of idea that people don't have opportunities. I think the kind of high profile layoffs have given the idea that there isn't options out there for people, but really there is a lot of options and there is still a lot of movement. And this conversation around loyalty, I think is huge because what I'm seeing is there are people who are really, really the difference between somebody being really driven in their work, being really focused, being really loyal, being really excited, and somebody who's just like, I'm just here. I'm doing the thing. I'm doing the minimum. I'm phoning it in. I'll do what has to be done. Not even quiet quitting. I think that's overstating it. Just like fulfilling on the job is immense. Like the difference between somebody who's really all in with on their like their project, their job, their team versus someone who's just showing up for it is easily like 50% of the value of that employee. And so I think from a perspective of even just valuing that if you're in a talent based world, are you getting the most out of your talent here?
I, you know, I question the premise of that a little bit, that it's like something new. I think that's always been the case, right? And for a very long time, what is it that, there's the percentage of people that carry the entire company. Those are the ones you invest in. It's a whole philosophy around this that companies have
Mhm,
had for a very long time. And who do you invest in? Companies have made a very specific decision in many cases that we're only investing in our high performers because they're the ones who impact the bottom line. Right. And then we kind of think about development plans to maybe manage people out. It's why we have these development conversations. You have those with your manager. They go have those with their managers and all the way up. Right.
mhm.
They identify who are our high profiles. Who are we going to invest in? We've been doing that for a very long time. I don't know if it's called quiet quitting, but who of us have always worked with people where you're like, right? And now suddenly, like, we have a name for it. I don't know that it's a new thing. I think the challenge of engaging folks who maybe are disengaged, uh,
Uh-huh.
you know, I think managers have always had to figure out how to manage that, how to
Mhm,
eat. And I'm not saying that, I guess it's just not a new phenomenon. And I think companies are looking at this like, now we have a problem because we have some people maybe who aren't performing. And the
mhm.
answer is we bring them back. I just think, well, what was the answer before?
Right.
Because they were there in the office. I don't know that, like, have those ratios changed that much? I don't know.
Yeah, I suppose I wasn't suggesting this is something new, only that um, I th- when people are experiencing this have to and this like now we must come into the office, there are those that like go along to get along. There are those who are actually really benefiting and appreciating. And then I think you are like creating like kind of a disengagement from a certain like portion of your employees who experienced a lot of agency and were feeling valued and in agency of their work and a sense of ownership of what they were creating and
Mhm.
are now being like treated as though they can't make good decisions for themselves,
Yes,
in the work. Yeah.
yes. I think that's absolutely true. And that's where, you know, that's what I mean by we're asking this question of, do we go back? Do we have hybrid? Like, every company's going to have to, they're facing this, right? And yes, you want people to be able to work together, but I think there's a different way into this conversation, which is, what is our opportunity? If we can think a little differently about this, if we're looking at, how do we engage people? How might we support them in the coming back so that what we're driving is loyalty, right? Because that's what's going to drive the innovation. It's people being able to show up and be excited and have creative ideas, right? That's what, if you're an artist, right? And you go through a spell, they call, but, writer's block, you have a dry spell as an artist. What do? Maybe you go to live shows, you meet up with other artists, you go to museums, right? You very much have the sense of like, I need to go out and figure out how to get inspired because it's your art and it's your craft.
Mhm.
But we don't kind of think maybe that same way as workers.
Mhm.
And we do it in relation to the other people we work with. We do it in relation to our companies. And
Mhm.
as a company, right? If you're in a dry spell, if, as a culture, there's a writer's block, if you will, how do we unlock that? What is the opportunity there? If we know there's this like creativity and this power in our organization, like, do we just sit back and be like, well, it's frustrating that no one's coming in inspired. Like, how do we tap into that and harness? And
Mhm.
I think it can be a way of thinking about that because it's presenting in itself in a really obvious way right now, where maybe it's been more subtle.
Mhm.
And that's what I mean by it. There's a way to maybe think a little bit differently about this. It's not just how do we go back to what it was. It's really looking at what is.
Mhm.
How do we move forward? And that might need to be a different way. And that's hard.
Um, and I know that you have done just so much research and looking at how this has gone well and how this has gone poorly. Are there any examples that like you can point to of either one examples that feel like, wow, this was a really like superb way to approach this, and others that maybe were like, oof, no wonder it turned out like that.
Um, yes, I have quite a few. I'll be careful. I don't want to name names. So very, the public ones, right? Let me step back. I don't know that there's a perfect right way to do it across the board. There's definitely a wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
When it's done the wrong way, there are course corrections, right? You look at maybe one end of the spectrum, like all the way over. That's like a Goldman Sachs, right? From the very beginning was like, we're going back day one. We have to go back, right? And so they put an edict in place, but even now aren't experiencing kind of the same levels back, right? How do you now enforce that? What do you do? What are the ramifications for it? Now we have to, right? And months in, they had to make concessions like we're going to give unlimited vacation for directors and above,
Mm-hmm.
right? Didn't want to walk it back from anything, but they had to, right? And the transitions or the changes that companies make to the policy are when it starts to hit the bottom line. So, and it does, and it has, and it continues to. And that's when even the most dogged leadership that says, nope, it's going to be this, have to now think about maybe it needs to be a little bit different, right? We're having an enormous amount of retention. We're having real difficulty with engagement, right? We are having a difficulty with, whatever it is. When it hits the bottom line, we have to make different decisions and have kind of, I think, a humility and a growth mindset as we go into things. The right way to do it at a big level is you really have to think about the communications and the experience that you are delivering to employees. And there's very much a how, right? The companies that have done a good job of this, and even then it's evolved, right? But you hear about like Airbnb, Adobe, now these are tech examples, right? But very much have gone through the transition kind of collaboratively with employees, have brought them along, have uh, in some cases, even pulled together employee teams to do the research, to advocate for maybe what's needed and work in conjunction with leadership to pull ideas, to collaborate. And when you do that, you were talking about agency, right? And people feeling empowered. So, how do we pull employees into this, right? How do we respect employees through these different pieces? And part of that is transparency. Here's what we know today. Here's what we don't know. Here's kind of the timing we're looking at. Here's the support we're going to offer. What other support maybe is needed? Like we're going to have a time where we're going to gather this information, right? And it's, I think, having some humility about saying, here's what we need to do. We maybe don't have all the details on how we get there together. And so it's thinking a little bit differently. And I think the wisdom of that is saying, what is our opportunity here to do
Mm-hmm.
it differently? Think about growth mindset. We think about, you know, being willing to really invite employees into the solution.
Mm-hmm.
If the solution is hybrid, right? I think the question isn't hybrid, that in many cases is the solution, and maybe it's not.
What I'm really just appreciating is that we are approaching this moment as though it's something brand new. Um,
Right.
because we haven't faced this exact challenge before, and yet we have faced the challenge of
Yeah.
change in our organizations before. And so, what I hear you continuously coming back to is the very fundamentals of change management, and that those haven't really changed, and that people are still people, and they still want to understand what's your purpose behind this. What questions are you asking? What are we trying to actually? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? What's the process? When are we going to check in and review if this is working? Where's my opportunity for input? And such that the process of change is the same. And uh, what I also really appreciate is that continuous focus on loyalty, and thinking of the employee as having an employee journey, and how is that whole journey being supported as we move through this process. I deeply enjoyed this conversation, and I'm wondering if you've got any last bits of wisdom for leaders who are maybe not at the top, but are engaged in recruiting in one way or another. They need to fill places on their team. What would you advise them about how they might advocate for a more holistic approach from using that employer brand as a value that needs to be considered in this
Yeah.
process?
That's a really good question. I think that one of the most important things is what's always been really important, which is to set very clear expectations, and uh, provide a lot of transparency about what's expected.
Hmm.
Right? If the company's going through a difficult time with this hybrid transition,
Hmm.
right? So we have a company that uh, kind of got brought into because things maybe weren't done, looking back, right? I think leaders would agree, maybe not done the way it could have been done. And it just absolutely exploded on Glassdoor, right? And scores went like this. And so there was you know, a lot of conversation, kind of drama, rightfully so, around this. And what do we do for recruiting? What do we do? And the reality is, it was a really big break and kind of a heartbreak for people who were there because they had certain expectations for what it was going to be. And when that shifted and they said, actually, we are going to go hybrid, turns out,
Hmm.
even though we said we weren't, but we'll all deal with it. And people were like, no. And, they had a lot of issues. And one of the things we advised was what's really important is if people are coming on board now, set a very clear expectation that this is hybrid because and you need to hire the people who are looking for that. This isn't about convincing somebody who's convinced that I don't want to go hybrid or trying to make that work for them. It's okay to own what the company is. And so, this is who we are today. We're moving forward. Right. And
Hmm.
so if you are now fully back, that means you can't hire from anywhere. That's
Hmm.
right. That's a shift. And we'll see how that plays out for people. Right.
Hmm.
And so now you have to have strategies. You have to pull back. You have to really think about, okay, this is about location based. So you have to change what you're doing from a recruitment marketing standpoint. You have to change maybe where you're going. You have to change your messaging on things. But it's really critical to say, here's why. Here's what we're doing, and here's what this means as an employee. Here's how we're supporting, and here's when you'll be in the office. And let people make the choices they need because you need the people in your organization who are going to support the decisions that you're making. And there's a shakeout.
Hmm. Um, that clear communication is so vital, and it's really just it strikes me how important it is for recruiters to be really transparent and honest, because we had this whole phase where people really felt like they could take a job anywhere from anywhere, and that became the norm. And now we're in this new era where if things are hybrid or they're fully in the office, people need to plan accordingly. And that comes down to salaries and cost of living and all of these other, um, you know,
Yep.
factors that we kind of could almost like ignore there for a whole minute.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. What a rich conversation. This is closing out our series on hybrid work, and what an honor it has been to close it out with you, Kirsten. Your expertise is just really valuable in the world, and I welcome folks to drop in their questions. And if you've got anything for Kirsten, we'll make sure her bio is linked so that you can contact her directly with your questions and concerns about how to manage the shift in work location while managing your employer brand. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Perfect.